Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Cheddar Podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by KosherKlav.com. One thing I appreciate about KosherKlav.com is how easy they make buying stam. Whether you're looking for tefillin, mezuzahs, a Megillah, or even a Sefer Torah, they take the time to explain the options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit KosherKlav.com, that's KosherKlav.com, or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find the link in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the notes and information in the show notes below. You can also find the link in the show notes to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more. Also, a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer it that way. And a comment about this episode. This episode is about the funeral of Rabbi Yosef, the chief rabbi of New York, whose yard site is this Thursday, Chaf Daled Tammuz. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Scott Seligman, who is a writer and historian, and we'll be discussing his newest book, which is titled The Chief Rabbi's Funeral, The Untold Story of America's Largest Anti-Semitic Riot, which was the riot at the Levaya of Rabbi Yosef, the chief rabbi of New York, in 1902, July 1902. And a really interesting story. So thank you, Scott, for joining me.
Pleasure.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I'm a nice Jewish boy from Newark, New Jersey. I had a long career in business, much of which kept me in Asia. I'm actually was sort of a career China hand. I was involved in China really shortly after its opening in the 1970s and 80s. And when I retired in maybe about almost 20 years ago now, I decided I wanted to do some writing. I'd been in the public relations business, and so I've done a lot of writing, but mostly for corporate CEOs and speeches and things like that. But now I had an opportunity to write for my own byline. And I wrote actually 4 books on early Chinese Americans, and then one on African Americans. And then I've gravitated to this whole question of hyphenated Americans at the turn of the 20th century, a little bit before that. And so naturally, I was led to my own heritage. I started writing about Jewish Americans. I put out a book several years ago called The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, which was fascinating. It was about immigrant Jewish women on the Lower East Side of New York who were confronted by rising prices of kosher meat that actually put it out of the reach of many families. And their backs were against the wall. These were Orthodox, observant women who wouldn't have thought of feeding their families meat that wasn't kosher. So the women took to the streets, and they rioted. Many were beaten up by the police. Many were arrested. But eventually they managed to get the price of kosher meat down. Yaakov Yosef, the rabbi we're going to talk about today, was in that book. There was a lot. He had a lot of roles to play in the kosher meat industry. In fact, that's really why he was brought to New York in 1888 by several Orthodox congregations on the Lower East Side to bring order to what had become a corrupt industry in New York City. And in the book, there's one chapter on his funeral and on the riot that followed it. But I only gave it one chapter. The truth is, it didn't even really belong in that book because it happened a couple of months after the kosher meat boycott was over. And you may know Andrew Silo Carroll, who writes for the New York Jewish Week. Andrew wrote a very nice piece about the book, and he followed it up the following week with an article just about Rabbi Yosef. And it got me to thinking that the story of the funeral riot and what happened after it actually deserved a more fulsome retelling than one chapter in a book that wasn't specifically about it. And that's really what got me on the idea of writing this book specifically about that, because it was in itself a seminal event in the history of American, or at least New York Jews. So that by way of answering several questions at the same time.
For sure. And Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, also for those that are familiar or aren't familiar, was also known as Rabbi Kolel, the chief rabbi, the only chief rabbi of New York in America.
And so a
Right.
very important, influential figure. He's still well known. There's been some books written about him, and many listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with him and his kever. People go visit his grave. And so he is, there's that. So, and we'll get there. But I want to start off with, let's talk about the Jewish community in the late 19th century. So before Rabbi Yaakov Yosef comes over from Europe as rabbi, or when he's there, with time of the riot, like contextualize for the listener, what are we talking about? What's the size of this community? What are the origins? Meaning, where are these people coming from? What's their level of religiosity? What's going on at the time in New York?
Well, there were Sephardim and there were German Jews in New York before the Eastern Europeans and the Russians started showing up. They started showing up in the 1880s. Um, Relatively small numbers of German Jews and Sephardic Jews compared to the influx that began in the 1880s and that ended in the 1920s, or at least tapered off in the 1920s. So at the time of this story, which is 1902, we're looking at about 600,000 Jews in New York City out of a population of 3.4 million. And that's a sizable chunk. They were the folks who invited Rabbi Yosef to New York City were Orthodox synagogues on the Lower East Side, and their congregants were Russian and Eastern European Jews. You mentioned the chief rabbi of New York, which Rabbi Kollel, which is what they called him. As a practical matter, he was never really the chief rabbi of New York. That was a model that they imported from Europe. A community in Europe would have had a chief rabbi. He would have had jurisdiction over the Jewish community, certainly over kosher meat, over the shoftim, over the mashgichim. And they because of the state of kosher meat, they wanted somebody like a chief rabbi to impose some order on the market. He actually had two other tasks, major tasks, when they invited him over. He was supposed to supervise the Beis Din, the religious court. And there was a lot of concern that the American-born children of these immigrant Jews were growing up with a real lack of knowledge about Judaism, about Jewish religion, about Jewish history. After all, they didn't go to cheder in the United States. This was the first generation that didn't. They went to the public school. And so one of the other tasks assigned to the rabbi was it was education. How can you make sure that we keep our children Orthodox, we keep them in Judaism, they don't become secular or, God forbid, Reform or Christian? So those were the tasks that got them to invite the rabbi in 1888, which went, hey. But as I say, he really was never the chief rabbi of New York. He was the chief rabbi of a couple of dozen synagogues on the Lower East Side, because the Rav Kollel model didn't work in New York City. The population was far too, first of all, large, and second of all, too diverse. You were never going to get all the Jews in New York, like including the Reform Jews uptown, were mostly the German Jews, to put themselves under the authority of an Eastern European Orthodox rabbi. That was simply never going to happen. So Rabbi Yosef was the chief rabbi of a couple of dozen synagogues on the Lower East Side. He was also the rabbi of record for the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol, which was on Norfolk Street. It was the largest of those Russian congregations.
Okay, let's talk about Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. Even though the book is really focused on the riot and the Levaya, but you do get in the beginning into him. So his biography, where he was born and his family, his teachers, and his move to America. Let's talk a little bit about his background first before we get to his death.
Okay. Well, he was born in Lithuania, a small town. I don't know how to pronounce it. Pozha, I think it is. About 120 miles northwest of Vilnius. He married. He had a son and two daughters. He studied with a couple of rabbis. I didn't really research his life in Europe, so I did a little bit of research because I knew you were going to ask me about that. There were two specific rabbis that he studied with. Naftali Yehuda Berlin, referred to as Netziv. He was at the Volozhin Yeshiva, and Rabbi Israel Salanter. Rabbi Yosef considered himself a disciple of Salanter, but who founded the Musar movement. But he wasn't fully, he didn't fully adopt the Musar system. But he considered himself sort of a spiritual heir to it. And he was an eminent Talmudist. And what the Americans were looking for was somebody like him with impeccable credentials. they weren't going to be able to find that among the rabbis already in New York or already in the United States. So they naturally looked to Europe for a rabbi. They consulted several prominent rabbis for nominations. They got a lot of names. In fact, he was not really the choice of his own colleagues in Europe, but they liked what they saw in his resume. They made him an offer. And he initially, there were several things actually when they made him an offer. He wasn't sure he wanted to do it. He wound up coming to the United States by himself without leaving his family behind in case he didn't like what he saw, and then he could just turn around and go back to Europe. But the other thing that was interesting about him was that, first of all, they offered him a king's ransom. He got $2,500 a year, which was a colossal amount of money in 1902. An average worker, a Jewish worker on the Lower East Side of New York, made about $10 a week. That's it. And so, and they outfitted a home for him, which actually had steam heat, which was also unheard of in 1888 when he first came over. But he also required a signing bonus, and the reason for that was that he was in debt. And the reason for him being in debt was not that he was profligate; it was that he was charitable. Money went right through his fingers. He gave it away to people who needed it, and so his creditors in Vilna threatened to block his passage unless he paid off the debts. So the American Jewish community was a little nonplussed by this. They didn't know how they would sell this to the Jewish community. That not only was he getting this huge salary, but he needed a huge bonus before he could come over. So they wound up doing it, collecting it sort of like private charity rather than making a big public showing of it. So he came over. He liked what he saw. He sent for the rest of his family. And he'd signed, I think it was a 6-year commitment to the job. It was a 6-year contract.
Right away off the bat, you mentioned some of this before. I mean, how accepted was he by all of the different congregations and shuls in New York, or wasn't he?
Well, yeah, he was accepted. Like I said, mostly by the Lower East Side Orthodox. He was not accepted by the Reform Jews. He was, I don't know how you'd say it, tolerated. It's probably too weak a word. He had good relations, let's say, with the uptown Sephardic Jews, most of whom were Orthodox. But that did not mean they wished to place themselves under his authority. And there was a group of rabbis that got together. I've forgotten the name of it. They got together from time to time just to discuss issues of common interest. And there were Reform Jews in the group, and he was willing to belong to that. He obviously had a very dim view of Reform Jewry, but it didn't stop them occasionally from getting together and talking about issues of common interest. But the only people who really were willing to place themselves under his authority were the original synagogues that ponied up the money to invite him, and he actually added to that when he came over, probably another half a dozen or so synagogues. And for them, he was the chief rabbi of New York.
What was his tenure like? And then you should mention the Kosher Meat Wars. In that book, you dedicated a chapter to the chief rabbi's funeral. In this one, I think it's the opposite. You have a little bit about the Kosher Meat Wars, but we should mention here the Kosher Meat Wars, besides for the rest of his tenure, what it was like before we get to the funeral.
He had a role in the Kosher Meat Wars besides just dying and having a funeral. Again, as I mentioned, one of the reasons they brought him over was that the kosher meat business was a mess. You actually had, in those days, butchers selling both kosher and non-kosher meat side by side. And you had people pretending that the meat they were selling was kosher. And the people had a distinct suspicion that when they were buying kosher meat, they weren't always getting kosher meat. And it was a well-founded fear. So this, of course, was intolerable to Orthodox Jews, that you didn't really know whether you were what it was you were eating. So that was the principal reason that they wanted to bring him over. They wanted him to assert authority of kashrut. And but the problem was that immediately, every time he tried to do something, there was opposition because the business was corrupt. A lot of people were making money off of it. And everything he tried to do backfired on him one way or the other, including sometimes with consumers. One of the innovations he introduced in New York was the use of the plumba, which was this lead seal that they would attach like the leg of a chicken to certify that it had been slaughtered in kosher fashion under the supervision of one of the mashkitim that he had hired, and also give the time of slaughter, which of course was important because you had to kosher it at home within 72 hours where the blood would coagulate. So this was, in a way, this was a service. The reason, but he had to charge money for it. And the reason they had to charge for it was that his salary was taken care of, but he had to pay the mashkitim. And in order to do that, they assessed a charge of 1 cent per chicken for a properly slaughtered chicken with a ploma. And it really was a fee for service. It was a service they were providing. It was providing to the consumer so they would be confident in what they were buying. But unfortunately, it was seen more as a money grab. And some of the rabbis who had been previously supervising kosher slaughter, not necessarily honestly, they sowed the doubts. So it became, unfortunately, an unpopular move when he tried to assert some authority that actually would rationalize the industry. He was also the rabbi, like I said, of the Beis Din. I don't have a lot of information about what he did there, but I do know that they had several meetings because a lot of Jews were getting divorced in the Beis Din and not bothering to get divorced by the city authorities, which essentially made them bigamists in the eyes of the city government. And the third thing was education of the youth. And there he was also, unfortunately, not a success. First of all, he never learned English. And everybody spoke English in that particular population. Didn't mean they didn't speak Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish at home. But the Yiddish that they spoke at home was not up to the task of understanding his Yiddish when he talked about Jewish history and he talked about Jewish philosophy and Jewish religion. So it was a misconnect. He really did not reach this important audience, which was the second most important reason that they had brought him over. So he did this for 6 years and was paid for 6 years. And at the end of the 6-year contract, there was really no appetite for renewing his credential, renewing it. And so he essentially became reduced to simply being a mashgiach himself. That was how he made his money. And also lending his name to certificates of kashrut that they could post in their they call them that they could post in their places of business. So he made money, but again didn't keep very much of it. And by the late 1890s, he really was poverty stricken. And to add to the problem, he also had a series of strokes, and he became bedridden. So by the time he died in 1902, he was almost forgotten. He was certainly not a factor, not a force to be reckoned with in the Jewish community in New York at that point.
Despite that, everyone suddenly remembered him when he died, and they said, "Oh, let's make this big funeral for the chief rabbi."
It was remarkable. It really was remarkable what happened. He had not been seen in public. His picture wasn't around. All of a sudden, they announce his death, and immediately people show up in front of his house in tears and saying prayers, and lots of people, lots of crowds. In fact, they started letting people in after they prepared the body. They started letting people in to pay their respects, and there were too many people. They finally had to just shut them all out because the family was just overwhelming. And that translated into the numbers of people that were interested in attending some way his funeral.
Before we get to the funeral, I think now we have to pivot and talk about New York, the police force, the politics in New York, the corruption. And this is a very important part of the story. So I think tell the listeners, contextualize and explain what was going on in that part of New York.
Well, unfortunately, the kosher meat industry was not the only area where New York was corrupt. There was corruption throughout. I mean, New York was governed by Tammany Hall, which was this democratic machine. And it was corruption czar us. I mean, a lot of people made themselves rich on the public on public money during this period. Tammany, among other things, was in charge of recruitment for the police department. And so, if you wanted to be a policeman, in addition to having lived in the United States for a year and and being an American citizen, you also had to pay money to a Tammany Hall man in order to be nominated. So there was corruption up and down the police department. There was also anti-Semitism in the police department. We'll get that in a minute. But the corruption side of it was that, for example, houses of ill fame, houses of prostitution were illegal. But if you paid off the right officer, you could stay open. The same was true of drinking on Sunday. If you had a bar and people wanted to drink on Sunday, you paid off the local cop. And in order to advance in the police department, you had to pay more money. If you wanted to be a captain, if you wanted to be an inspector, and it was too much money for any one person to afford. So what a policeman would do is he'd go to the various businesses on his beat and collect money from them so that he could afford to be promoted. And it was a good investment for the business owners because it meant that they'd have a friend in the firmament that there would be various ways for them to profit from the fact that they had put this guy in office. The other thing that police were particularly reviled for on the Lower East Side was that they hassled the push cart vendors. The people who just, like my grandparents, my great-grandparents, I'm sure, who sold stuff on the streets. And you had to get a license to do it. If you didn't have a license, the police would hassle you and fine you. If you did have a license, they would still fine you, or they would threaten to put you off the streets or something like that. So there was a lot of resentment against the police, who were also, as I mentioned, many of them anti-Semitic. There were a lot of Irishmen on the police force in particular, and there was no love lost between the Irish community, immigrant community, and the Jews. The Irish had been bottom on the totem pole when they came over because they were mostly Catholic, and America was a Protestant establishment, and they knew they were looked down on. They really had a lot of the blue-collar jobs sewn up. But when the Jews showed up, there was somebody even lower on the totem pole that they could hassle, and that's what they did. And there was a lot of violence against Jews, but yet the Jews also knew that they needed the police. Because if people were hassling them, they could call the police and they could get a certain amount of protection, if not justice. And when they complained about the police, I found one case in the 1880s where the police had hassled, in this case, it was a labor union, which again, very heavily, they were on strike. They actually had a strike permit, but that didn't matter to the police. They started beating up strikers. Tammany Hall didn't like strikers. They didn't like unions particularly. And then when the Jews protested, they actually got the police department to offer them a hearing. And they went in and they started to testify before the inspector, who they had put in charge. And he stopped them and he said, "You may as well go home. I will never believe a Jew under oath." So that's what they were up against. The idea that the police would show up and start beating heads was unfortunately not as rare as it ought to have been. Even in the kosher meat boycott, which was primarily female driven, there was police were beating up people in the streets. A lot of people were injured in that. A lot of people were arrested. A lot of people were injured. And in 1902, as awful as it was for the police to beat somebody up on the street, it was unseemly to be beating up women. So there was a great deal of resentment when this drama began.
The Levaya, the funeral. As you said before, many people showed up. They suddenly remember Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, like, oh, we got to go to this funeral, we got to go to Levaya. So there were preparations, there were expectations of a large crowd. But were they expecting enough? So what were the expectations that the organizers were expecting? And then how many police officers did they get to kind of be there to oversee the funeral procession?
Let's back up first and say who the organizers were. Because this was not a rabbi. This was not a person who could be immediately interred in the ground as soon as he was dead, which, as we all know, is Orthodox practice when it's possible. First of all, they wanted to allow rabbis from other cities to come in to honor him. But there was a bigger problem. He had not left any instructions for where he wanted and how he wanted to be buried. And so there was actually a bidding war for the rights to plant the rabbi in your cemetery. Most of the cemeteries around Brooklyn, and several of the congregation under his aegis wanted the honor of hosting his grave. They got together in a funeral committee, but of course the family was also very much a part of this decision. So there was a full day of meetings to discuss how they were going to handle this. And the organization that won the day was, in fact, his whole congregation, the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol. They had a plot in East New York, I think it was. And the reason that they won was that they promised the largest annuity to the rabbi's wife. So the family was okay with him going there. And in fact, as I think I mentioned in the book, it turned out to be a great investment on the part of the synagogue, because once they had identified where the rabbi was going to be buried, people started bidding on the contiguous plots because they wanted to be close to him. So they actually wound up making money on this proposition, but I'm not sure that they foresaw that. So then the question was, how do you do the funeral? There was no synagogue in the Lower East Side of New York remotely large enough to hold the number of people that they anticipated were going to want to come to a funeral. So they came up with the idea, not really original. Apparently, it had been used in the Old Country occasionally as well, of a funeral procession that would wend its way back and forth through the streets of the Lower East Side and stop at the porticos of a half a dozen of the synagogues that had been under his authority for brief prayers and eulogies. After which, the procession would proceed down Grand Street to the ferry terminal, go by ferry to Brooklyn, continue on to the cemetery, and then the funeral. So once they had established what they wanted to do, one of the members of the funeral committee went to the police department and said, we're going to need a permit for this, and we're going to need some police protection. He had no idea how many people were going to show up. And so when they pressed him, he said, I don't know, 20,000 people, something like that. And as a result of that, the officer in charge, who did not question him, simply said, all right, well, we'll send 25 police officers. That ought to be enough. And then later that night, before the day before the funeral, a reporter from one of the Jewish newspapers, we don't know who, actually called the police and said, 20,000 people is way too small, and so are 25 officers. You need to rethink this. But that information never went up the chain to the inspector who was in charge the next day. And so you had literally tens, probably hundreds of thousands of people in this funeral when it eventually happened in this procession, and 25 officers to keep order. And that was the beginning of the problem.
Do we know the estimated size of the crowd?
It depends on which newspaper you read. Some said 100,000, some said 300,000. It was the procession itself had a couple of hundred carriages. They had signs on the side that said who they were, head of this congregation, rabbi from such a congregation, that sort of thing. The mockers, the muckety mutts in the Jewish community were all there. There were about 300 yeshiva bookers who led the procession singing psalms. And then after it were literally tens of thousands of mostly congregants from Lower East Side synagogues. And that didn't count the number of spectators there were, sitting on the stoops and on the roofs and on the fire escapes and in the windows. And the estimate there was hundreds of thousands, mostly Jewish, but actually not all Jewish. There were Gentiles who were interested in this spectacle as well. So you got to imagine that these are narrow streets on the Lower East Side, and this funeral procession is going through, and there is simply no room to breathe. Every square inch of sidewalk is taken up with a person.
And this is late July, 1902. So you have to imagine that it's hot, and they're walking through, and then they get to the R. Ho and Company factory. What can you tell us about the R. Ho and Company and the factory and the workers there, and what happens when the procession reaches the factory?
Well, the Ho Company was probably the largest manufacturer of printing presses in the United States. And, it tells you something about 1902 that their big factory was in Lower Manhattan, with the real estate there. They actually had built it in several stages. It took up an entire city block on Grand Street. And they were actually responsible for several innovations in printing technology during the 100 or so years they've been around. In fact, one of them was a technology that took the costs out of printing newspapers. And they were indirectly responsible for the plethora of newspapers that were available at that point. The owner of the factory, the president of the company, was Robert Ho, the third, I think he was. He was a direct descendant of the original founder. And there were hundreds of people who worked in this factory. They also were very proud of an internship program, of an apprentice program that they had instituted, where they were training neighborhood boys. But first, they were educated. They would select neighborhood boys. They would teach them not only printing technology, but, regular school subjects, feed them lunch. And the ones who excelled, the ones who passed, were offered jobs at the factory. So there was a coterie of young people who worked there, in addition to the old hands. A lot of them were immigrants, not particularly Irish, although there was scholars for years thought that it was Irish workers at the factory that actually attacked the Jews. And in fact, a professor up at Holy Cross wrote a very convincing article that said they probably weren't Irish at all. And I did a little research myself. Every name of a factory worker that showed up in the newspapers as having been involved in this riot, I went back to the census records to figure out who they were and what their ethnicity was. And they were mostly German. But, okay, so you have this group of young people who are working there, and they're mischievous. They go out at their lunch hour. There are Jews on their way to the synagogue. And these were the guys that pulled on the beards of the old Jewish men. And they threw banana peels at them from the upper floors of the factory, or apple cores, or things like that. They really harassed them. It was probably more childhood mischief than it was, vicious anti-Semitism, but these were obvious odd people that I think they felt they could pick on. So there was a tradition at this factory of anti-Semitic behavior. But on the day of the rabbi's funeral, with hundreds of thousands of people in the street, a very important day to the Jewish community, nobody thought that was going to be a problem, including the police. Nobody anticipated that there would be anything anti-Semitic about it.
Lo and behold, that was a mistake. So when they get there, they suddenly get attacked. It's a fire hose. What happens?
Well, the first thing that happened was epithets. People were starting to yell at them from the upper stories of the window. Again, picture this. The street is absolutely filled with people. You can't move. And they started calling them names. One of the names that showed up in the text was a sheenie. This was a thoroughly offensive word for a Jew. I only know that word because my grandmother told me somebody called her that when she got a job at a department store in, 1908, whatever it was. Get out your sheenies or we'll soak you, was one of the things they said. And they started throwing things at the procession. First, it was cotton waste. But then it got worse. Then it was blocks of wood, and it was pieces of metal, and it was screws. And it was things that really could injure somebody. And in fact, they started throwing it at the crowd, and it did start injuring people. And people were initially just overly kind of surprised by the whole thing. And then they got mad. And a self-appointed delegation of a half a dozen guys went into the factory to talk to the managers and ask them to stop what was going on the upper floors. Managers weren't aware of what was going on the upper floors. They see a bunch of guys come in yelling at them in Yiddish, and they got scared, and they got a fire hose and they ejected everybody from the factory. So at this point, the Jews on the street did the only thing they could think of to do. They picked up the projectiles that had been thrown at them and they threw them back at the factory. And they managed to break every one of the windows on 2 exposures in the factory. Hundreds of them, but more than 100 windows. And then the water started, water cannons. They had fire hoses upstairs in case there was a fire in the factory. And both cold and hot water were sprayed on the ground. Someone was scalding. People got burned. And this went on. And Robert Ho, after they ejected the delegation from the factory, picked up the phone and called the police and asked for reinforcement. Because those 25 officers who had been delegated to work on this, most of them were beyond the factory at this point. They were with the hearse. And the Hertz was already down at the pier at the end of Grants. So there was almost no policeman to keep order when this was going on. So Robert Ho gets on the phone, asks for reinforcements. They send a half a dozen vans with like 200 policemen under the command of this one particular police inspector named Adam Cross. Now, unlike a lot of the policemen, Adam Cross was in fact not of Irish descent; he was of Dutch descent. But he pretty much shared the prejudice of the Irish when it came to Jews. He was also thoroughly corrupt. Took money from the houses of prostitution. Took money from the men on the beat who were the pushcart vendors. And he had been investigated in the late 90s and also accused of malfeasance by a group of religious leaders, including a couple of prominent Jews, not rabbis, but just prominent Jews in the community. So Adam Cross had no love for Jewish people. He shows up. He confers with Robert Ho. He makes no effort to distinguish aggressors from victims. He makes no announcement for people to disperse. He simply orders his men, and this is a direct quote, to club the life out of them. At which point, the couple of hundred men under his command pull out their billy clubs and they start beating up Jews. And a lot of people were injured. In fact, more than a couple of hundred people were injured in the process.
So you got Bedlam. There's besides the things being thrown and the fighting, now the police are in there. They're beating everyone up. So,
Right.
I mean, what happens now after this? Basically, what's the end of the riot, and then what's the Jewish response and the media's response to what happened? There was this riot. The Jews were attacked. They fight back, and suddenly the Jews are blamed, and they're all beaten and attacked.
Yeah. Well, the blaming happens almost immediately. First of all, the procession continued into Brooklyn. There was a little kerfuffle in Brooklyn, but not a big one. They managed to get to the cemetery and bury the rabbi. But obviously, this left a pretty bad taste in the mouths of the Jews, and several of them had been arrested. And they were taken to the Essex Market Police Court, where a magistrate, who was, again, not terribly fond of Jews, was presiding. What I thought was really interesting and unusual was the Jewish attorneys who simply showed up to defend the Jews who had been arrested. They probably worked the Essex Market Police Court. They were around, or they were called. But unlike the kosher meat war of a couple of months earlier, which was entirely a creature of the Lower East Side Russian and Eastern European Jews, this was a who's who of the entire New York Jewish community. There were uptown German Jews. There were downtown Russian Jews. There were Reform Jews. There were Orthodox Jews. There were Democrats. There were Republicans. There were pro-Tammany Hall. There were anti-Tammany Hall. This was such an egregious offense against the Jewish community that everybody came together and in order to defend the Jewish community. They, in the meantime, both Robert Ho and Adam Cross had already spoken with the press, and both of them said the same thing. The Jews started it. The Jews came prepared to do battle. They knew that that the factory had an anti-Semitic history, and they came loaded for violence. It was a preposterous assertion. These were people who were there for the funeral of their rabbi, whom they had decided recently that they loved again. And then there were all sorts of convenient little lies that were brought up. Adam Cross said, "Well, we took a look at the street before the funeral, and there were no projectiles on the street. And a lot of the projectiles that were found in the factory that had broken the windows did not originate in the factory. So we can only conclude that the Jews came armed." Robert Ho concurred in this. He did later on allow that he had some some problems with anti-Semitic workers. That it wasn't a particularly philo-Semitic factory. There were a few Jews who worked there, but not a lot of them. But this was actually not unexpected by the Jewish community. they knew somebody was going to try to blame them. And so that night, a number of professional Jews, doctors and lawyers and businessmen got together, and they decided they needed a strategy to make sure, number one, that the Jews didn't get blamed for this, and number two, that people were brought to justice who had caused these injuries. And they set up an organization called the hell was it called? The East Side Vigilance League. Now, this was normal practice back then. Whenever the Jews had a problem, they would set up an ad hoc group. There was no umbrella group to represent. During the Kosher Meat War, they set up the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association. During the Rent riots, they had a Rent Protective Association. Every time there was a problem, they would set up an organization. And the organization only lasted long enough to see the problem through, and then they always disappeared. And after this, it was not long after this that the Jewish community finally came together to set up what they call the New York Kehillah, which was an umbrella organization. It didn't last all that long, less than maybe a couple of dozen years, and then it was gone. I think it was 1920s; it was already gone. But this was one of the incidents that convinced them that they needed an evergreen organization that was always ready and loaded to fight whatever battle the Jews needed to fight. And it was not long after that the Anti-Defamation League was founded, that the American Jewish Congress was founded, the American Jewish Committee was founded. But in 1902, all they had was the East Side Vigilance League. And the East Side Vigilance League got started, and the first thing they did was call the mayor. Now, I got to back up a little bit here. I mentioned Tammany Hall, and Tammany Hall was in charge of New York's governance most of the 19th century. But in 1901, right before this happened, at the end of 1901, there was a mayoral election, and Tammany Hall was kicked out. And the man who was elected mayor, Seth Lowe, was a Philo-Semite. He wasn't Jewish; he was a New England Brahmin, but he had been the mayor of Brooklyn before the boroughs all merged into the city of New York. He'd been the president of Columbia University. He was always available to the Jewish community. He went to the openings of the YMHAs. He made sure Columbia didn't give examinations on the high holy days. He really was a friend. And he ran for when he ran for mayor. He had the support of a large percentage of the Jewish community, and he only won by 30,000 votes. So he knew he actually owed a debt to the Jewish community, and they knew it too. And this was payback time. And they called the mayor and they said, "We would like an impartial investigation of this because we don't believe the Jews were responsible for it." And he tripped over his feet. First thing he did was he sent a note to Partridge, Colonel Partridge, whom he had appointed a few months earlier to clean up the police department. He was the new commissioner of police. And he said, I want to report on my desk the next day or so about what happened on the Lower East Side to the Jewish people. Well, Partridge, unfortunately, he made the unfortunate mistake of asking the inspector who had ordered the riot, who had ordered the beating, to write the report. And so it was no surprise when he blamed the whole damn thing on the Jews. So the mayor gets this report on his desk. And the Jews immediately knew if Inspector Cross was writing the report, they were not going to get a fair share. And so they went back to the mayor and said, "We need a civilian investigation. This is not going to work." The police went through the motions of an investigation, but nobody believed in their ability to police themselves. And it was a well-founded fear. So the mayor gave them a citizens committee, 5 people, 2 of whom were Jews, prominent. Louis Marshall, in fact, was one of them. And he gave them a broad mandate. He said, "You don't just have to talk about what happened on that day of the riot. If there are other issues the Jewish community has with the police, we want to hear about them too." And it was like turning on a spigot. They had days and days of hearings. People showed up and complained not just about what happened in front of the Hoe factory, but other incidents that they had with the police. It was as if they finally had an opportunity to bare their souls in a way that they felt they were going to be protected from retaliation. And when that committee finally issued its report, it was blistering blisteringly damning, let's say, of the police department, even of the magistrates, who had said, look, you guys, half the time you don't give the Jews a fair hearing. And because you're so hostile to them, you're essentially giving permission to the police to do more mischief when it comes to the Jews. So this was also when we believe the first citizens committee ever appointed in the United States to investigate an ethnic riot. Lord knows we've had many of them since then.
And how is this all perceived in the media, in the newspapers?
The newspapers were not, how shall I say this? They were not surprised that people had problems with the police department. They had problems with the police department. There was a great deal of support for the Jewish community in the papers. They believed, it did not take much to believe that the police had acted inappropriately. And of course, the Jewish newspapers were very much for the Forvets, the Daily Forward, actually went so far as to call it a pogrom, which it really wasn't. I mean, nobody was killed in it. It wasn't pre-planned or anything like that. But a lot of people were injured. And, to immigrant Jews who had very recently witnessed pogroms in Russia and in the other countries, it was still civilians beating up innocent, peaceful Jews and the police joining in, which is what happened very often in the old country. I think they can be forgiven for making the analogy.
What was the aftermath of the riot? After all this, the committee, everything, what was that aftermath?
Well, a lot of things happened. They just did not get everything they wanted. There were trials of a few of the home company people and a couple of policemen, actually, who had been accused of abusing Jews. Nobody ultimately was convicted. The evidence was thin, and they didn't convict them. But there was a lot of movement within the police department. First of all, several of the police officers who knew they were going to get investigated decided it was time to retire. So a number of them just took the package and left. Other policemen were transferred out of the Lower East Side, put them out of harm's way, including actually Inspector Cross. He was moved to Brooklyn someplace, and there were resignations. They actually managed to get Colonel Partridge to resign, and his deputy, whom they particularly loathed because he had been abusive of women during the kosher meat riot. So there were a lot of they did get something out of it. First of all, they got exonerated by every committee that looked at it. There were a lot of committees. They had the police committee. They had their own two committees. They had the civilian committee. And then there was also a minor victory when Robert Hoe approached the city for money to compensate him for the windows that had been broken. And he was pretty much told to pound sand. So that was a minor victory as well. It wasn't everything they wanted. But what it was but it underscored the fact that things had changed in the 20th century, that the Jews now had a measure of political power that they had not had before, that they had friends in the firmament, and that you couldn't just step all over the way the police had been doing it before and expect that there would not be backlash. I think that's the important point.
What would you say is the legacy of the riot?
Well, I think that's it. I think that that anti-Semitism, it's been here since before the founding of the Republic. It's going to be here when you and I are long gone. And when we meet Rabbi Joseph in the next world, it will still be anti-Semitism in the United States. It expresses itself in different generations in different ways. It has many different reasons and many different excuses that are given for it. And obviously, we should always try to use education to combat it. That's what the ADL and those groups do. But I think the lesson of the 1902 riot is that when it morphs into intimidation and violence against Jews, it crosses a line. And our best response as a community is to unify, to organize, and to use whatever political power or influence we have with the authorities to ensure that it's punished so it's less likely to occur in the future.
Okay, so Rabbi Yaakov Yosef's Yartzeit Chaf Dalet Tammuz, he was nifter July 28th, the riot was July 30th. I will link to the book in the show's notes, Chief Rabbi's Funeral. So it's published by Potomac Book, which is an imprint of Nebraska Press. I'll link to it. And I'll also link to the Great Kosher Meat War because that's relevant and connected. And thank you, Scott, for joining me.
My pleasure.